Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The canyon floor held heat like a furnace, the red rock walls trapping the air until every breath felt baked dry. It was midday in the Arizona Territory, summer of 1879, and the cicadas whined so loud that silence could no longer be trusted. A tall man moved along the narrow trail, his steps steady but careful, boots crunching on loose gravel. His name was Elias Boone, 42 years old, worn thin by years of hard service. A scar stretched above his right eyebrow, pale against sunburnt skin, a mark left by a cavalry saberback when he had ridden as a scout. He no longer wore the uniform, no longer believed in the flag he once served under. The war and the years after had left him hollow, carrying memories that showed up in sleep and in the way his hands sometimes hesitated before reaching for a gun. His purpose now was simple: move quietly across the land, find day work when it came, and keep drinking out of his life. He had been sober for 3 years, but the pull of whiskey was a shadow that trailed him everywhere he went. Rounding a bend in the canyon, he stopped dead. 20 paces ahead stood a young Apache woman, her figure tense against the sandstone wall. Her clothes were worn thin, a torn buckskin shirt clinging to her shoulders, sandals cracked and ready to fall apart. She looked half-starved, her dark hair in loose braids that had come undone, and her eyes were wide, sharp with fear but alive. She raised a rock in both hands, voice cutting through the canyon in halting English. "Snake, between your legs." The cry echoed so fiercely it almost sounded like more than one voice. Elias looked down, calm at first, then realized what she meant. At his hip hung his coiled lariat, looped and darkened with sweat. In the glare, it did look like a snake, and in her panic, she hadn't seen it for what it was. He felt the moment stretch. He could raise his hand, could speak too fast, could make her bolt. His mind weighed the options in an instant. A frightened person with nothing left to lose was as dangerous as any outlaw. Slowly, Elias lifted both hands and spoke low. "It's a rope. Just rope. Nothing alive." He unhooked it from his belt with careful movements, letting the coil drop to the ground where it thudded harmless. He stepped back, boots crunching. Her grip on the rock stayed tight. He could see her chest rising and falling too fast, her eyes darting between him and the lariat. His thoughts turned practical. If she ran, she'd likely collapse before sundown in this heat. If she stayed, he needed her calm enough not to strike out at him. "I'll walk past," he said, voice even, not soft but steady. "I won't touch you." He moved slow along the canyon wall, shoulders turned so she wouldn't feel trapped. Inside, the tension gnawed. One wrong twitch from her, and he'd have to defend himself. And the thought of hurting a woman, an exile or runaway by the looks of her, soured his gut. He'd done enough harm in his life. She lowered the stone only when he was nearly past her, the echo of her cry still hanging in his ears. The canyon was quiet again, the cicadas filling the space where fear had been. Elias kept walking, but his thoughts stayed sharp. This was no chance meeting. The woman wasn't just hiding in the canyon for shade. She was running from something or someone. He didn't ask, not yet. He had learned that answers came when people were ready, and forcing them out only led to regret. For her part, Nayline, though he didn't know her name yet, kept her back to the rock, body stiff as a drawn bow. She had fled her own people only days earlier, carrying the weight of exile like a brand. Captivity among whites had left her marked in the eyes of her tribe, branded unclean by elders who saw her return not as survival, but as shame. Her reason for being here was survival, nothing more. Trust was not a luxury she could risk. Yet when a man had dropped the rope instead of raising his gun, when he had passed her with his hands open, something inside her shifted. Fear remained, but the edge of it dulled. Two strangers, each carrying years of loss, had crossed paths on ground where heat and emptiness killed the unprepared. Neither of them had planned it. Neither had sought it. Yet both knew, deep inside, that walking away might be the same as signing their own death. So, even in this first encounter, a decision was made without words, to move forward, for now, on the same road. The canyon stretched narrow for another half-mile before it widened into a basin littered with scrub and loose stone, and Elias Boone slowed his pace enough so that the Apache woman could follow without feeling driven. He had noticed the way her sandals slapped the ground unevenly, the leather thongs worn near breaking, and he knew every step cost her more than she wanted him to see. The air shimmered with heat, heavy enough to choke, and though his own throat burned, he forced himself to ration the canteen. He had told her there was water farther on, but in truth he was not certain how much the seep held this late in summer. He thought about that as he walked, calculating the miles and the heat, already forming a plan if the spring had run dry. Behind him, Nayline followed at a cautious distance, her body angled like someone always ready to flee. She studied him with suspicion, not understanding yet why he had not forced her to speak, why he had not asked where she came from or who chased her. For days she had been moving alone through the stone country, carrying nothing but a small cloth tied at her waist and the weight of rejection pressing harder than hunger. In her tribe's eyes, her return from captivity among whites had made her untouchable, and the shame they placed on her left no room for her to remain. Now, with no family to return to, no allies, she moved through the desert waiting for death or something close to it. The stranger's silence unsettled her, but it also gave her room to breathe. By late afternoon, the heat forced them into the shadow of an overhang. Elias set his gear down and pulled the canteen, holding it out without stepping too close. She hesitated before taking it, as though the offer might conceal a trap, but the thirst in her throat left little choice. She drank in measured sips, each swallow careful, as if afraid the water would vanish with the next breath. Elias watched her and thought of his own days crossing dry country with cavalry scouts, when men had died less from bullets and more from thirst and miscalculation. He could see the same desperation in her eyes now. When she handed the canteen back, she spoke, her English rough but clear enough. "Why do you help? You do not know me." He didn't answer right away. His instinct was to say nothing. Silence had carried him through worse, but he caught the flicker in her eyes, that balance between trust and suspicion. He finally said, "Because no one lasts out here alone. Not me. Not you." It was the truth stripped of any softness, and he hoped it would be enough. They sat with space between them, the silence filled with the hum of insects and the crack of cooling stone. Elias thought about the way she had cried out earlier, mistaking his lariat for a snake. The fear in her voice had been real, the kind that comes from weeks of danger layered over years of mistrust. He wondered what she had endured during her captivity would have been done to make her own people cast her aside. He wanted to ask, but he knew better. Questions had to wait until a person was ready, and forcing them only built more walls. To ease the silence, Elias drew his sewing kit from his coat pocket and set the broken sandal across his knee. He looked at her first, waiting for permission. When she gave the slightest nod, he began stitching the torn leather with careful, deliberate motions. She watched his hands, every needle pass measured against the doubt she carried. As he worked, he thought of his own life, how he had once chosen paths for others in the army, maps that sent men to their deaths, decisions he could never undo. He wondered if the woman could see the kind of weight in him, or if she only saw a stranger trying to mend a sandal. When the repair was finished, he handed it back without a word. She traced the seam with her finger, then looked up at him with something that wasn't gratitude exactly, but not mistrust either. A shift small but there. Night approached, the sky fading to a hard gray. Elias built a fire tucked low against a rock to hide the smoke. He split a strip of jerky and warmed it on a flat stone, passing the larger piece to her. She took it after a pause, chewing slowly as though unused to sharing food. As the fire crackled, Elias thought of what questions might be burning in her mind. Who was he? Why was he alone in a canyon in midsummer, carrying no banner, no companions? He guessed she wanted to know if he was a bounty hunter, a deserter, a drifter without purpose. The truth was simpler. He was a man trying to cross the territory without falling back into whiskey or violence, aiming for a stretch of land near the border where rumors said a man could find work in a quiet corner. It wasn't redemption, but it was forward. Before sleep, Nayline spoke again, her voice almost lost under the crackle of fire. "My name is Nayline." It was given carefully, as though she could take it back if she needed. Elias met her eyes across the firelight and said, "Elias Boone." They let the silence return after that, each of them measuring what it meant to give a name in a world where names were often written down only on wanted posters or graves. For now, it meant they had chosen not to walk away. The fire had burned down to a glow, the rocks around it holding the heat like hidden coals. Elias sat with his back against the canyon wall, hat tilted low, listening to the desert breathe. Nayline lay a short distance away, her body turned slightly from him, but not so far that she couldn't see him if she opened her eyes. It wasn't yet trust, but it wasn't pure fear either. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile, a silence both had carried for years in different ways. Elias shifted his boots, the sound crunching softly in the dirt, and he thought about the questions hanging in the air that neither of them had voiced. She must have wondered why he carried no companions, why a man of his age and bearing walked the land alone. And he, though he told himself it wasn't his business, wondered how far she had run and how much was chasing her. When dawn broke, the air turned cold enough that their breath showed white. Elias woke first, stirring the embers and setting a tin cup of water near the heat to take the edge off. Nayline rose moments later, slow and stiff, her face drawn from sleep that had not been deep. Her eyes flicked toward him, cautious still, but when he pushed the cup of warmed water across the ashes toward her, she accepted it. That small gesture eased something between them. After they ate, he checked her sandals again. The stitching had held, but he could see she had been walking long before their meeting. Her feet swollen, the skin rubbed raw. He said nothing about it, but when he broke down the fire, he decided to keep their pace slower. She noticed. By mid-morning, they reached a flat stretch where the canyon opened, a place Elias remembered from his scouting days. He knew of a seep tucked under limestone, though he worried it might be dry. He led them across the gravel and scrub, keeping his eyes sharp for movement. He thought again about what the woman must suspect. Most lone white men who came across an Apache woman in exile wouldn't have treated her with the distance he had. She might believe he wanted payment later, or that his patience was a mask. Elias felt the weight of that thought. He knew if he wanted her trust, he had to show her he had no such intent, not with words, but with actions. At the seep, water trickled thinly but enough to drink. Elias filled both canteens, handing hers back first. Nayline crouched at the pool, washing her face, and for a moment the guarded look slipped. The cool water reminded her body it was still alive, though her mind clung to the exile stamped upon her. She had expected death by now. Meeting Elias had changed that, though she didn't yet know what that meant. They rested under a mesquite. She asked him then, her voice low, "Why do you travel here? This land is empty." It was the first direct question she had put to him. Elias weighed the answer. He could have lied, told her he was just passing through, but he had learned that lies bred faster than weeds. He said, "I'm headed south, closer to the border. A rancher I knew once owed me honest pay, said there'd be work clearing brush and mending fence if I came. Maybe it's still there, maybe not. Either way, I keep moving." He didn't mention the part about staying away from whiskey towns or the faces that sometimes followed him out of sleep. That much was his burden. Nayline listened, her expression unreadable, but she gave a short nod. She did not press him further, but the answer seemed to satisfy her enough. Later that day, while Elias mended the strap on his saddlebag, Nayline finally spoke more of herself. She told him her name again, this time with strength, as if daring him to remember it. Nayline. She explained in halting words that her people had not forgiven her return after captivity, that she was cast out not for what she had done, but for what had been done to her. The words came flat, without tears, but Elias could hear the weight. He didn't tell her she had been wronged, didn't say she deserved better. He knew empty reassurances meant nothing. Instead, he nodded once and kept stitching the bag, showing by his stillness that he accepted what she told him without judgment. That night, as the fire crackled low again, Nayline sat closer than before. They shared jerky and a small piece of cornbread Elias had saved from the last town. The food was plain, but eating together settled them more than words could. Elias thought of how strange it was. Two people who had every reason to walk in opposite directions now bound by need, by circumstance, by a thin trust earned in the simplest ways. He thought of how many nights he had spent alone, chasing ghosts across open country, and how this night felt different, not easier but steadier. When sleep came, he lay awake longer than usual, listening to her breathing settle. He wondered what tomorrow would bring, and for the first time in years, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a choice. By the fourth day of moving together, the silence between them had begun to feel less like a wall and more like a shared space where both could breathe. Elias walked ahead most of the time, scanning the trail, while Nayline followed close enough to see his boots press into the dirt. They had spoken little beyond what was necessary: water, food, direction, but she no longer watched him with the same sharp suspicion as on the first day. Even so, Elias understood she must still wonder why he kept his distance, why he hadn't tried to claim her in some way, why he offered protection without demanding a price. In her experience, men did not work that way. Elias, for his part, thought often about how to keep her safe without giving the wrong impression. He had seen too much of the other kind of men, and he wanted her to know he was not another weight around her neck. When they reached the edge of a small town called Dry Needle, Elias felt her hesitation. She slowed her steps, her hand brushing against the strap of her torn satchel as though ready to retreat. He knew the risks. An Apache woman walking into a border town would draw stares, maybe worse. But supplies were low, and the water's skins nearly empty. He looked at her and spoke plain. "We need food. I'll handle it." She shook her head once, as if bracing for insult, but she followed him anyway. The town was little more than a dust-packed street lined with false front buildings, a saloon at its center with doors that never closed. The stench of whiskey and sweat poured out as Elias pushed through the batwings. Nayline lingered at the threshold, but stepped in when she saw he didn't stop. Inside, the place fell quiet for a moment, as it always did when strangers walked in. Men leaned at the bar, cards slapped on tables, boots creaked on old floorboards. Most eyes went to her first, her dark braids and worn clothing marking her at once as different. A few looks carried plain curiosity, but others narrowed with hostility or something worse. Elias kept his voice steady when he called for flour, coffee, beans, and new canteen, setting coins on the bar without fuss. He could feel Nayline behind him, stiff and alert, every muscle ready to bolt. That was when the trouble came. Two cow hands at a nearby table, both deep into whiskey, turned their attention toward her. Their words started as muttered remarks, but grew louder, careless, and sharp. One of them laughed in a way that scraped the air, then stood and stepped toward her with a swagger that Elias knew too well. Nayline's shoulders tightened, her chin lifting as though she had already prepared herself to endure whatever was coming. Elias moved before the man reached her, stepping between them. His eyes held no heat, only a steady warning. "Leave her," he said. The cowhand chuckled, mistaking restraint for weakness, and reached again. Elias's decision was made in an instant. He shifted his weight and struck with clean, practiced movements, a hand clamping the wrist, a sharp drive of the shoulder, a twist that sent the man crashing onto a table. The impact splintered the wood, the room gasping with surprise. The second cowhand half rose, then thought better of it when Elias's revolver appeared at his side, not pointed but resting in a way that left no doubt. Elias didn't boast, didn't threaten. He simply said, "You'll leave her be." His voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from a man who had seen enough death to know he didn't want another, but would take one if forced. The barkeep stepped forward, his face lined with years of this same trouble. Elias laid a coin on the counter to pay for the broken table, tipped his hat, and turned to leave. Nayline followed, her back rigid, but her eyes lingered on him with a different look now. Not gratitude spoken aloud, but recognition that he had put himself between her and danger without hesitation. Outside, The sun hit them like a hammer. Elias carried the supplies in silence, but inside his chest his thoughts ran heavy. He wondered what she made of him now, if she saw him as a shield or as another kind of threat waiting to turn. He hoped it was the first, though he didn't expect her trust to come easy. For Naline, the moment had stirred something unexpected. She had braced herself for humiliation, for the familiar sting of being less than human in the eyes of men who saw her as a target. But Elias had stepped in without asking for anything in return, without claiming her afterward. It unsettled her more than open hostility because it forced her to consider the possibility that not every man carried cruelty in his bones. Still, her mind pressed questions she dare not voice. Why did he help? What did he carry in his silence? And could she believe in this protection when the desert and the towns alike had already taken so much from her? As they left Dry Needle behind, the distance between them on the road closed by a few paces, not enough to touch, but enough to notice. The trust was fragile, but it was growing, carried forward by actions rather than words. The desert opened before them after Dry Needle, a flat stretch of thorn and scrub, the air so heavy with heat that each breath rasped dry in the throat. By noon the ground seemed to glow, and the horizon wavered as if the whole world were trembling. Elias Boone pushed forward with the supplies slung across his shoulder, but each step grew heavier, his body sagging under the weight of more than just the gear. Sweat soaked his shirt, leaving dark patches under his arms, and a dull ache spread across his temples. He knew the signs, heat pressing him toward collapse. He slowed his pace, telling himself he could manage it, but his legs betrayed him. Finally, he stopped beneath the thin shade of a mesquite, one hand braced against the trunk, the other clutching his side. Naline watched from a few paces back, unsure at first if this was a trick or weakness. Her eyes narrowed, studying him. She had seen men feign weakness to catch others off guard, and she had no reason yet to believe he wasn't the same. But the slump of his shoulders and the tremor in his hands told a different story. He was not pretending. He was breaking under the sun. Elias sat down hard against the tree, dragging in shallow breaths. He unhooked his canteen, but barely managed to swallow before his throat closed against it. His thoughts clouded, memories pushing forward uninvited. Long marches as a scout when men had dropped in the dust, eyes staring blank at the sky while officers ordered the rest to keep moving. He had seen death like this before, and the echo of it made his chest tighten. He thought briefly that if this was his end, he would die the same way he had lived the last years, alone, far from home, with no one to mark the grave. But then Naline crouched before him. She took the canteen from his unsteady hand and poured a thin line of water across his lips, careful not to waste a drop. Her voice came low, quiet but firm. "Drink slow." He obeyed, swallowing only what she allowed, 10 measured sips. She soaked a cloth in the remaining water and pressed it against his neck and forehead, cooling the skin that burned like fire. For a moment he met her eyes, surprised by the steadiness there. He saw no mockery, no contempt, only the calm determination of someone who had learned too young that survival was not a choice but a demand. Naline spoke in her own tongue, words Elias couldn't understand, but the tone carried a weight he did. She wasn't praying. She wasn't pleading. She was simply keeping him tethered to this world. Elias closed his eyes, letting the sound of her voice anchor him, and slowly his breathing evened. The dizziness eased. His mind cleared enough for shame to creep in. He hated appearing weak before her, hated the thought that she might now see him as another burden she had to carry. When he opened his eyes again, she was sitting close, mending the strap of her sandal with his needle and gut thread. Her movements were precise, her face calm, but he could sense the unspoken message. She would not abandon him for weakness, just as he had not abandoned her when the townsmen circled like wolves. He broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "I used to be a scout. Years back, I chose trails for men, thought I knew what I was doing. But the paths I picked, they led others to their deaths. Sometimes whole groups. I told myself it was duty, but it was blood. And every time the heat hits me like this, those faces come back." The words left him heavy, but they were honest. He had never told them to anyone, not even drinking companions when the bottle loosened his tongue. He expected her to turn away, to see him as a killer, but Nayline only paused in her stitching. She met his eyes for a brief moment, gave a small nod, and returned to her work. No judgment, no absolution, just acknowledgement. It was more than he deserved, and it steadied him. They stayed under the mesquite until the sun dipped lower, then rose to continue on. Elias moved slower, and Nayline adjusted without complaint. For the first time since meeting her, he realized she was no longer following him. She was walking beside him. That night, their camp was quiet, the fire low. Elias lay back on his bedroll, the stars hard and cold above. Nayline sat nearby, sharpening a stick to use as a walking aid. He thought of how the day had turned, how his weakness had shown her the truth he tried to bury, and how she had chosen to stay anyway. It was a kind of mercy he hadn't expected. For Nayline, the day had shown her something too. She had wondered if he was strong only when the fight was simple, when the threat came from others. Now she had seen him vulnerable, admitting the ghosts he carried, and still he hadn't turned cruel. That steadiness in the face of shame told her more about who he was than any display of strength. She didn't say it, but in her silence she decided that for now, he was someone worth walking beside. The air cooled slightly by morning, though the ground still radiated the heat of yesterday. Elias woke first, his body stiff from the episode beneath the mesquite. He checked his pulse and felt steady enough, though he knew the desert could push him back into weakness at any time. Nayline was already awake too, sitting with her back to a rock, working her fingers through her hair to untangle it. She glanced at him briefly, then returned to her task. It was not indifference, more like an understanding that words weren't necessary to mark that both had survived another day. They broke camp without ceremony and walked until the sun climbed higher. The land shifted into a dry wash. The soil cracked into plates, cottonwoods leaning hollow over the shallow cut of sand. Elias slowed his pace, instincts humming. He had ridden through too many ambushes not to notice the silence here. The birds gone quiet, the absence of small sounds. He lifted a hand, signaling Nayline to stop. She obeyed, her eyes narrowing. She had learned to read his signals by now. Two men eased down the bank ahead, rifles in their hands. Their clothes were ragged, boots split at the seams, faces unshaven and drawn thin by hunger. These weren't professional killers, Elias thought, but desperation made men more dangerous than skill did. One called out with a hoarse voice, demanding coin or boots, adding a slur out of habit more than hatred. The other smirked, shifting his rifle like he was showing teeth. Elias kept his stance calm, his voice low. "You don't want to try this. You're not ready to shoot me, and I don't want to kill you. We got jerky and flour. Take that and walk." His hand hovered near his revolver, but didn't draw it. He could feel Nayline's breath quicken behind him, and he knew she was calculating her options. Run? Fight? Trust him? He didn't turn, but he said softly, "Don't move. Don't run." He knew running only encouraged the wolves. The taller drifter stepped closer, rifle jerking upward. His hand shook, betraying nerves. Elias read it in a second. This was a man bluffing, trying to appear bigger than he was. Elias fired a single shot into the ground at the man's boots. Dust spat up, stinging his shins, the sound cracking like thunder in the wash. The drifter flinched back, cursing. In that instant, Nayline acted. She had scooped a stone from the wash without Elias noticing, her arm swinging fast and clean. The rock struck the nearer drifter's forearm with a sharp crack, sending his rifle tumbling into the sand. Elias pivoted, revolver still steady, his voice sharper now. "Leave it, both of you." The men froze, the fight bleeding out of them. Elias picked up both rifles, weighing them as he spoke. "You walk away now. You don't follow. You don't wait. I'm leaving you food. That's more than most would give." He dropped a sack of flour and a strip of jerky onto the ground. His tone left no room for debate. "If I see you again, there won't be another warning." The drifters backed away, muttering curses but not daring another move. They climbed the bank and vanished into the brush. Elias lowered his revolver but kept his eyes on the horizon until he was sure they were gone. When he turned, Nayline was watching him, her chest rising fast, but her face steady. Her knuckles were white around the stone she still held. He nodded once, a small gesture that said she had done right. She dropped the stone and exhaled. They sat a while in the shade of the wash, the tension draining. Elias cleaned the rifles, setting them aside. He wouldn't keep them. He didn't want the weight of stolen guns dragging behind him. Nayline finally spoke, her voice quiet. You gave them food. It wasn't a question. It was wonder mixed with confusion. Elias answered plainly. I've seen hungry men kill for less. You give them food, maybe they walk. You take everything, and they'll come back with nothing to lose. I've had enough of men with nothing to lose. He didn't add that he had once been that kind of man himself, back when whiskey and guilt had stripped him to the bone. For Nayline, the moment settled something she hadn't admitted even to herself. She had wondered if his protection came from pride or from seeing her as his responsibility. But now she saw the truth. He wasn't trying to own her. He was trying to live by choices he could bear to carry. His restraint, his refusal to kill when he could have, told her more than any promise. They climbed out of the wash together as the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching long. For the first time since she had joined him on the trail, Nayline walked at his side instead of behind him. The distance had closed, not with words, but with action and decision shared. That night, as they sat by the fire, Elias looked across at her and finally said, You don't have to fear me. He didn't ask her to believe it, didn't press. He just said it and left it in the air. She held his gaze longer than before, then gave the faintest nod. It wasn't full trust. Not yet, but it was the beginning of something stronger than survival. The fire was small that night, built low between two flat stones, so it would not be seen from far off. The desert air had cooled, but the heat of the day still lingered in their bones. Elias sat cross-legged, slowly running a whetstone down the blade of his knife. The scrape carried into the silence like a steady heartbeat. Nayline sat opposite, her knees pulled close, braids falling loose over her shoulders. The glow of the fire caught the lines of her face, hard from what she had endured, but not yet broken. For a long time, neither spoke. It had become their rhythm, days filled with cautious movement, nights filled with silence. Yet both carried questions that pressed heavier than the gear on their backs. Elias knew she must wonder about him. What kind of man had survived this long? Why he walked alone? Why he hadn't used her weakness against her? He had wondered the same about her. What she had endured during her captivity, what it had cost her to walk away from her people. It was Elias who broke the silence first. His voice was low, as if speaking too loud might stir ghosts. I put the bottle down 3 years ago. Before that, I lost men I called friends. Lost myself too. He set the knife down and looked at her across the fire. One night, a man bled out in a stable because I'd promised to watch his back and didn't. I was drunk, couldn't lift my head. He died because of me. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. That's when I quit. And I left the outfit that paid me to hunt men because every trail I followed put another body in the dirt. I got tired of adding names to a ledger no one would ever read. He didn't look away as he spoke, expecting to see disgust or fear in her eyes. Instead, Nayline watched him without flinching. When he finished, she gave a short nod, as if acknowledging, not forgiving, not condemning, but hearing him. The weight of it eased something in his chest. Then she spoke, her words careful but steady. I was taken from my people by raiders. Months I lived among whites, used as labor, sometimes worse. Her eyes dropped to the fire, her voice sharpening as if to cut away weakness. When I was traded back, the elders looked at me and said I was unclean, said I could not marry, could not have children, could not sit among women who once were my sisters. Their law was old, but they used it against me. She swallowed, her jaw tight. I left before sunrise. Better exile than to stay where I was less than nothing. Elias let the silence hold her words. He didn't try to soften them or offer comfort. He knew empty assurances were worth nothing. Instead, he reached into his pack and set a strip of smoked meat near her. A small thing, but it was his way of saying she was not unclean, not worthless. She took it without looking at him, but the faintest tremor in her hands betrayed what it meant. They ate slowly, the crackle of the fire the only sound for a while. Above them, the stars burned sharp and close, the sky cold and clear. Elias leaned back, looking up, and thought of how many nights he had spent alone with only his regrets for company. Tonight felt different. Not easy, not safe, but different. He realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't planning where he'd leave someone behind. He was thinking about where they might go together. Nayline shifted closer to the fire, her eyes reflecting its glow. She spoke again, quieter this time. "You could have left me. Many times. In the canyon. In the town. With those men by the wash. But you didn't." She paused, searching his face. "Why?" Elias considered his answer. He could have said it was duty, or pity, or the need for company on the trail. But those would have been lies. The truth was simpler. Because leaving's what I've always done. And I'm tired of it. Nayline studied him, her expression unreadable, but she gave a slow nod. For her, it was enough for now. The fire burned low, and they spread their bedrolls. This time, the space between them was smaller than before. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to share warmth from the same fire without needing distance as a shield. As Elias closed his eyes, he thought of how far they had come from the first cry of alarm in the canyon. They were not family, not lovers, not yet anything that could be given a name. But they were no longer strangers either. What held them together now was not accident but choice, fragile, unspoken, but real. And for both of them, that was enough to see another day. The next day broke with a pale sky, a thin rim of light stretching over the desert horizon. Elias rose first, stirring the last coals of the fire into smoke. Nayline woke moments later, her hair loose from sleep, and for the first time since their journey began, she didn't immediately scan the land around them for danger. Instead, she simply watched Elias as he set a tin of beans over the heat, his movements slow but steady. That small pause, that brief easing of vigilance, said more than words could. By mid-morning, the wind shifted. A low whistle began across the flats, carrying dust in thin veils that stung their eyes. Elias's jaw tightened. He had crossed this land before and knew what the rising wind meant. "We need cover," he said. Nayline nodded, trusting the urgency in his voice, and together they moved toward a shelf of layered rock at the edge of a draw. By the time they reached it, the wind had grown sharp, lifting grit into their clothes, filling their mouths with the taste of sand. They worked without speaking, securing their packs with stones, wrapping the water skins in cloth so they wouldn't be scoured by grit. Elias tied his hat under his chin for the first time in years, while Nayline bound her braids back with strips of rawhide. When the gust struck hard enough to shake their bodies, they pressed against the rock and waited it out. Hours passed like that, the air filled with the constant hiss of moving sand. Elias's eyes watered, his lips split, but he kept his body angled to shield her from the worst of it. She noticed, though he said nothing. As the afternoon faded, the wind began to drop. They sat together in the hollow they had carved out, their backs pressed against the same stone. Elias stretched his arms, sore from bracing against the storm. Nayline unwrapped her braids, shaking grit from them. For the first time since they had met, she let out a short laugh, rough, almost surprised at its own sound. Elias turned, raising an eyebrow. "What's funny?" She shook her head. "You look like the dust itself, old and gray." He let out a dry chuckle, the sound rusty from disuse. And for a moment the storm felt less like survival and more like a test they had passed together. When the sky cleared, they took stock. Supplies were running thin. The beans nearly gone, flour down to the last handful, jerky stiff and scarce. Elias laid the items out, counting what they had left. Nayline watched him, then asked the question that had lingered since the first night. "Where will you go when the food ends?" She needed to know if she was walking with him toward a plan or only toward more wandering. Elias rubbed at the scar over his brow before answering. "There's a ranch I knew once, south of here. Belonged to a man named Roebuck. He was strict but fair. Last I heard, he still needed men to mend fence and clear brush. If it's still there, he'd trade shelter for work." He paused, meeting her eyes. "If you want to keep walking with me, that's where I'd aim." Nayline absorbed this in silence. The idea of shelter, of any place not built on exile or rejection, pressed against her heart in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She asked cautiously, "And if you will not have me?" The weight of her past lay in the question. Elias thought for a moment, then said firmly, "Then we keep moving until we find a place that will. But I won't leave you there." The certainty in his tone settled her more than the promise itself. That night, they didn't travel farther. Instead, they camped by the rock shelf, the stars sharp and cold above them. Elias patched a tear in his saddlebag, while Nayline worked a strip of leather into a simple cord, threading it with a few beads she carried hidden in her satchel. When she finished, she tied it near the flap of her pack. It wasn't decoration. It was a marker, a way to make something hers in a world that had tried to strip her identity. Elias noticed, but didn't ask. He understood that some things were not meant to be explained. As they sat by the fire, the questions that might linger in a listener's mind, their exact destination, whether Elias truly intended to stay sober, whether Nayline could ever be accepted anywhere, hung in the air. But the way they leaned slightly toward the fire at the same angle, the way their bedrolls lay closer than the night before, answered enough. Tomorrow they would walk toward Roebuck's ranch. For tonight, they allowed themselves the rare comfort of rest without watching every shadow. The desert had tested them with storm and hunger, and both were still standing. That, for now, was victory enough. The road south carried them into country Elias remembered faintly from years before. Rolling scrubland broken by dry arroyos, the ground dotted with cedar posts leaning at angles where old fences had given way. Each mile tested their resolve. The food was nearly gone, and both were thinner than when they had met. Yet the idea of reaching Roebuck's ranch kept their pace steady. For Nayline, it was the first destination that sounded like more than escape. For Elias, it was a chance to prove, to himself most of all, that he could still work honest land instead of drifting until the bottle found him again. By mid-morning of the third day, they saw smoke curling from a chimney ahead, a thin thread rising above a cluster of cottonwoods. The lined shack came into view, sun-grayed boards, a sagging porch, but walls that still held true. Elias slowed his steps, his chest tight with a mix of hope and unease. He hadn't seen Roebuck in nearly 10 years. Men changed him less. Would the rancher remember him as a steady scout who had pulled his weight, or as another drifter tied to an ugly past? Nayline sensed his hesitation. She asked quietly, "This man, he knows you?" Elias nodded. "Knew me. Once. Hard to say if that matters now." She looked at the shack, then back at him. "If he refuses, what then?" He answered simply, "Then we keep walking. I won't leave you here." She gave a small nod, the same answer he had given her before, but this time it carried more weight, because he had already proved those weren't empty words. They reached the porch just as hoofbeats approached from the east. A rider came slow, reins loose in one hand, the other resting easy near his saddle horn. He was older, his beard neat, his eyes sharp but not cruel. He dismounted without hurry, studied them both, and tipped his hat. "Jacob Roebuck," he said, voice steady. His gaze moved to Elias. "You've got the look of a man I've seen before." Elias removed his hat. "Elias Boone. Road Scout, work out this way. You paid me once for guiding a herd through dry country. Didn't lose a single steer." Roebuck studied him another long moment, then gave the faintest smile. "I remember. Thought you were dead." Elias shrugged. "Not yet." The rancher's eyes shifted to Nayline, not unkind, but measuring. "In her." Elias answered without hesitation. "Her name's Nayline. She works. Harder than most." Nayline met Roebuck's stare, her chin lifting, and added in her careful English, "I can mend fence, clear brush, haul water, whatever is needed." She listed each task as if daring him to doubt her. Roebuck's smile deepened slightly. "Straight answers. I like that." He laid out terms plain. 2 months of work, fence mending, ditch clearing, spring tending. Payment in staples and coin. Shelter in the shack. If the work held, he would speak for them at the land office about a small lease by the spring that no one claimed anymore. "I don't give charity," he said, "but I don't waste good hands either." Do right by the work, and you'll have ground to stand on. Elias extended his hand, and Roebuck shook it, sealing the agreement without flourish. Nayline watched closely, understanding the weight of that gesture. For the first time since her exile, someone had looked at her and seen ability, not shame. The weeks that followed were filled with the honest soreness of labor. Together they hauled cedar posts, tamped earth, stretched wire until their palms blistered. Nayline cleared brush from the spring head, mud streaking her arms, her strength surprising even herself. Elias swung an axe until his shoulders burned, sweat pouring down his face, the rhythm of the work keeping his thoughts steady. At night, they ate beans and cornbread provided by the ranch, simple meals that tasted richer than anything they'd had on the trail. Each evening, as they returned to the shack, small changes took hold. Elias kept his revolver tucked away instead of always at hand. Nayline began speaking more in English, sometimes teaching him words from her own tongue when the coyotes called at dusk. Their bedrolls, once separated by a cautious distance, drew closer by honest inches. They didn't name what was happening between them, but it was clear enough in the way they lingered near each other, sharing silence without tension. Listeners might have wondered, would the rancher truly give them land? Would Elias keep his promise of sobriety under the strain of hard days? Would Nayline, once branded unclean, ever feel her worth restored? The answers unfolded not in speeches, but in the small truths of each day. The work was real. The coin was real. The trust between them, built on sweat and silence, was real. By the end of the second month, the fences stood strong, the spring ran clean into the trough, and Jacob Roebuck rode out to inspect the work. He studied the straight lines of wire, the clear ditch, the solid posts. Then he nodded. Good enough to last a season. You've earned what I promised. He handed Elias a slip of paper, a note to the land office, written in his own hand, vouching for their right to claim the unused spring plot. Don't waste it, he said. That night, Elias and Nayline sat on the porch of the shack, bowls of stew in their hands. The sun dipped low, painting the land in quiet light. For the first time since their paths had crossed, the horizon ahead no longer looked like emptiness. It looked like the beginning of a place they might stay. Morning broke cool after a rare night rain, the smell of wet clay clinging to the air. Elias and Nayline stepped out of the shack together, the ground darkened by patches of moisture that would vanish before noon. The land looked cleaner, as though the storm had washed away more than just dust. Elias filled a tin cup at the spring and handed it to her first, a habit he had formed without thinking. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a moment longer than necessary, neither pulling away too quickly. By midday, Jacob Roebuck arrived with his wagon, a circuit preacher riding alongside and the preacher's wife seated beside him in stiff Sunday black, despite the weekday sun. Roebuck dismounted, dusting his coat. I figured, he said, his eyes flicking between Elias and Nayline, that you two have done enough work together to call yourselves more than just drifters sharing shelter. If you got a mind to make it official, here's a man who'll write your names in his book. His tone was plain, not pushy, but firm with the kind of practicality frontier life demanded. Elias looked at Nayline. He felt his chest tighten the way it had in battles long past, when he had been forced to choose quickly and live with the weight of it. Only this choice felt different, less about survival, more about the life he wanted to build. He cleared his throat. I'd stand with you, Nayline, not just for today, for the rest of it. No running, no bottle, no leaving you to fight alone. His voice shook slightly, not from doubt, but from the gravity of speaking something he had never allowed himself to say aloud. Nayline studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then softened with the smallest of smiles. You have lived many years carrying shame. I have lived carrying exile. But I choose you, Elias, not because I must, but because I want to. Her words were simple, but they cut through every doubt that had lingered since the canyon. The preacher spoke short and clean, no grand sermon, just the necessary words. They stood before him, side by side, as witnesses signed Roebuck's ledger. Elias's hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name, steadied only when Nayline's hand brushed against his sleeve. When it was done, the preacher closed his book and said, "You are husband and wife before God and man." The simplicity of it struck Elias harder than any rifle shot he had taken. It was done. He was no longer walking alone. Roebuck handed them the lease papers for the spring plot. "It's yours now. Build it, mend it, make it last. And if you ever need a neighbor, you know where I ride." With that, he tipped his hat and left them with the preacher's blessing and the future in their hands. That afternoon, Elias walked into town and sold one of his revolvers to a peddler, buying a milk goat, a bolt of calico, and a sturdy pair of new shoes for Nayline. When he returned, she stood at the doorway of the shack, watching him with eyes that carried both surprise and quiet gratitude. He handed her the shoes first. "Strong soles. You've walked enough on broken leather." She took them, running her fingers over the stitching, and for the first time since they had met, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Inside the shack, they arranged shelves, swept the floor, and set the table Roebuck had loaned them. Nayline tied a small strand of beadwork above the doorframe, its colors catching the evening light. "So this place remembers me," she said softly. Elias answered, "And me too." They ate stew on the porch that night, the goat bleating impatiently in the pen, the spring running clear and steady behind the shack. Elias leaned back in his chair, looking at Nayline in the fading light. "Strange thing," he said. "If you hadn't thought my rope was a snake, I might have walked past without stopping." Nayline smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Then I'm glad I was wrong." The desert stretched quiet around them, but for once it didn't feel empty. It felt like theirs. There were no debts left unpaid, no enemies waiting in the shadows, no questions left hanging. Just two people who had chosen day by day and then all at once to stay. And for the first time in either of their lives, the road ahead did not look like survival. It looked like home.